This is my 162nd video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part will deal with my attempts to progress with my Hornby Dublo 3-rail tabletop railway, trying to fix up the tabletop itself to be a bit more level and stable, running experiments with the Duchess of Atholl and a 264 tank that I just received, and checking out and trying the Hornby controller that came with the Duchess of Atholl set. The next thing that I wanted to do after the activity of my last video was to try some measures to keep the tabletop surface I was working on more reliably stable and level. I was using a 6 foot by 2 foot 5 inch table, folding table, that I bought from Canadian Tire, and I had laid a 6 foot by 3 foot 4 inch surface over that using matting tiles that I bought from Walmart. But the matting tiles were overhanging the table surface by just over 5 inches front and back, and they weren't really rigid enough to prevent some sag. So I figured that I needed to put something else underneath the foam flooring tiles to prevent them sagging where they overhang. I had originally thought of using MDF, and that's certainly nice and rigid, but it's very heavy stuff and not the easiest to work with. Checking out what was available at Home Depot, I decided to use the pack of rigid foam insulation shown here. This pack provided 6 pieces, each 1.5 inches thick and 4 foot by 14.5 inches. I figured that the 1.5 inch thickness should give enough rigidity, and 5 pieces 14.5 inches wide should be just a ½ inch longer than the 6 foot table. Given that I had concluded that I didn't have enough space for 6 foot by 4 foot and had cut down the width of my surface to 3 foot 4 inches, I would need to cut down the length of the foam pieces, but I'd got pretty good at cutting this type of foam with the heated tool that I bought on Amazon. So I cut down 5 of the 4 foot foam pieces to 3 foot 4 inches. I did this using the heated wand fitting of the tool, running it along the metal edge of a ruler that I taped to the foam at one end, so that I could use one hand to hold the other end of the ruler in the foam itself and the other hand to operate the cutting tool. This worked quite well, giving me 5 quite neat pieces 14.5 inches by 3 foot 4 inches. I used some double-sided tape to hold these pieces in position on the tabletop. This wasn't intended to be a super fast permanent bond, just something to stop the pieces from sliding about. I worked my way across the table, trying to keep the pieces as well lined up as possible. Unfortunately, since the table was folding, I couldn't get it to sit perfectly level in the middle. There was a very slight downward angle on either side of the fold in the table, which resulted in a slight step between 2 of the foam pieces seen at centre here. I couldn't really fix this. Well, I suppose the only way to fix it would be to put something underneath the left side of the foam piece. But then the next 2 pieces would also have to be raised and angled. Tricky to get right. Having laid that many pieces of the white foam, I moved across the black foam tiles and the track, and then moved across the rolling stock, and then the remaining black tiles so that the left side of the table was clear to complete the laying of the white foam pieces. I continued to lay the pieces with double-sided tape underneath, completing the length of the table. The pieces fitted together well, except for the slight step seen before. Then I put the black tiles back. Theoretically, the 5 pieces of white foam should have been just a ½ inch longer than the 6 foot table, but they actually came out about 1 inch longer, so maybe they were a hair over 14.5 inches wide, or maybe the extra ½ inch was because I didn't get them perfectly butted together. Having done that operation on the tabletop, I returned to messing around with my locos. I received this 3-rail 264 tank. This model is based on the BR-4MT tank, but that was derived from a long line of LMS 264 tanks from Fowler through Stanier and Fairburn, so this model can pass as an LMS engine pretty well from a distance. I actually have a 2-rail Wren model from this same tooling that Wren sold in LMS livery. I really don't know why Hornby didn't use this as their LMS tank, rather than the 062 vaguely based on the LNER-N2, which didn't really look like any type of LMS engine at all. Anyway, this model is going to be rebadged as an LMS engine for my operations, but for now I just wanted to check its running and compare how it did to the performance of the Duchess of Atholl. The 264 was sold to me on the basis of its being fully professionally serviced and remagnetized, so I was interested to see how its performance compared to what I was able to get out of the Duchess.
Well, this tank engine, this is a 003 264 tank, basically based on the British Railways 4MT, which was an evolution from the LMS 264 tanks. This came to me, I bought this as professionally serviced and remagnetized. Now, I'm just going to show you, I'm going to zoom out here because I've got to reach over and turn on the... Okay, now that's actually full power. That is 100% full power on the Duet controller. And it's not really going any faster than my Duchess of Atholl. So what this tends to lead me to conclude is that the problem is not so much my Duchess of Atholl, it's either this track or the suitability of trying to use the Duet controller. Now he's running in a bit of, we'll turn him down a little bit to like 90, 80, 90 to 80. You see, even then he tends to stop there. That's because the power just doesn't, you'll see he almost stops back there. That's about 85%. Well, I got to clean the connections on the track. The track is not passing power back to that far corner very well. So clearly, anyway, we'll go back to 90% or whatever. Clearly this guy is not really going any better than my Duchess of Atholl on this track. I haven't done any servicing on this guy, but then I shouldn't need to. I bought it as a fully professionally serviced and remagnetized model. And it's not going any better than my Hornby. My Duchess of Atholl, it's almost stopping. Let's just try it backwards, see if it goes any better backwards than forwards. Nope, not really. No, worse, if anything. I mean, who knows how well it was serviced. Maybe it could do with some more servicing, but nevertheless, this generally leads me to suspect the problem is not particularly so much the Duchess of Atholl there. There's the Duchess of Atholl sitting next to him, but I'm suspecting the problem's not so much the Duchess of Atholl then as either this track, the top of the track's cleaned, so you'd think at least where the power's going in that there'd be decent power, even if it isn't passed round very well. But it's either this track or just that the Duet is not a very suitable controller for the Hornby Dublo 3-rail. I don't know. Well, this 3-rail stuff is continuing to prove somewhat like hard work. Now, this is the chassis to the 264 tank. At the moment, it's just a 6.4 tank because it's not got its front pony truck on. But, as you can see, this chassis is now running a heck of a lot better than it was running before. I mean, that's still at high power. It's at 90% power on the Duet. Why don't we turn it down to about 80% now? No, maybe that's a bit too much. You do need a lot of power, these things, but it was running at 100% power and barely getting round at all before, although it was supposedly professionally serviced and remagnetized. I certainly haven't remagnetized it because I've never remagnetized it, but what I have done is taken the body off and cleaned the wheels and the pickups and oiled everything again. Lubricated the motion, lubricated the axles. I checked the bearing. The bearing seems to be... I didn't change it, so I'll give the person who serviced it that. They seem to have adjusted the bearing properly. It had like, about 1 millimetre of play or so when it's cold, or a little bit less than 1 millimetre, which is probably about right, because as it gets hotter it expands, so you don't want it to tighten up too much. So you've got to have a little bit of play in it, but not so much. It's certainly running a lot better now than it was. Mind you, of course, who knows? From my experience with the Duchess of Atholl, it'll probably run worse again when I put the body back on. That's a terrible join. That's the worst join. Not just because of the track, it's also because it's the place where there tends to be a... The problem is there tends to be a slight change in the angle of the table there, because it's the underlying table is a folding table, and I couldn't get it to lie 100% flat. That's backwards with about 90% power. Well, I don't know, we'll keep trying. But I can't say this goes a lot better, and that's it. And the Duchess of Atholl chassis went better without the body than with the body. We'll try putting the body back on this again and see how it goes. And we may try some other experiments. Well, like the Duchess of Atholl, this guy doesn't run quite as well with his body back on as he did with just his chassis. Which is probably not surprising, because the bodies are heavy. This guy, even perhaps more so than the Duchess of Atholl, it's an incredibly heavy body. So when you put the body on, you know, the model is carrying a lot more weight than when it's just running with a chassis. It's a heavy, heavy model, this one. It is definitely running a lot better now than it was before, though. That's 90% going forward. It was barely getting round when I first ran it. But now, after my lubrication, I'm warming up a bit. Warming up helps, of course, that it's warmed up. But after my lubrication and whatever, it is definitely running a good deal better. So maybe we'll even risk turning the power down a little bit. See, as soon as you turn the power down, it barely gets round there at all, though. That's the problem, because there's not much power like that. I've got to take this track apart and clean the track connections. Yeah, because, as soon as I reduce the power, that's about 80%, and, that's not bad now. That's not too bad. Yeah, that probably is better than the Duchess of Atholl can do at 80%. We'll see. Okay, this is the Duchess of Atholl without its tender, running at exactly the same speed, the same power setting as the the 264 tank was just running. It's almost as good, except it perhaps slows down a teeny bit more around the back there. Yeah. Gotta clean that track. It's not the top of the track, it's like the connections between the track, I think. But I don't know what I can do about the levelness of the track there. That's really annoying. The table just doesn't quite lie level, so there's a bit of a slight angle between those two pieces of track. Yeah, I mean, he's going, especially now we're giving him a bit more chance to warm up, he's going about as well. So maybe that's about as well as I'm going to get these engines going. They're both going, this one I've done what I could, pretty much everything I could to service it. And the other one was supposedly professionally serviced, but I did some additional lubrication. And they're running fairly comparably now. See, he's definitely speeding up a little bit as he warms up as well. They warm up, I guess the lubricant gets warmer, things flow better, and they get a little bit faster as they warm up. So there we go. I think, I don't know if I'm going to do too much else to the engines now. I may try I want to do some work cleaning the track, and I'm thinking of some other potential experiments in terms of powering things. Maybe we'll try and bring him to a standstill. There we go. He stops. I mean, once the power drops below about 60%, he stops altogether.
My next plan was to see if I could do anything useful with the Hornby controller that came with the Duchess of Atholl set. I initially wasn't planning to try to do anything with this, but things weren't going all that well with the H&M Duet, and I'd managed to find out what type of transformer this was supposed to work with, so I thought it might be worth trying to give it a go. I had some hopes that maybe it might even work better with the three-rail locos than the Duet. After all, this controller and those locos were originally made to work together. I started out by checking the controller with my multimeter. I wanted to be sure that it wasn't going to do anything really nasty like directly shorting out the input. I checked both the input and output terminals, mainly measuring the resistance as the operating handle was moved. I see that the meter here is showing 666. I hope that's not an omen. The readings actually wandered all over the place, but there was certainly nothing like a short circuit. I had managed to determine that this type of controller was meant to be used with the type of transformer shown at left here. The label on the transformer can't be read in this picture, but I was able to find pictures where the specs of the transformer could be read. As you can see, the transformer was designed for UK mains input and output 12 volts 1 amp. Now that I think about it, I assume that was 12 volts AC, as this was just a transformer. I didn't really have a straight transformer to output 12 volts AC, but I did have an adapter designed for Canadian mains to provide 1 amp of 12 volt DC output. I tried connecting that adapter to the inputs of the Hornby controller and measuring the output. The output went up to a bit over 10 volts. Moving the handle all the way over to the other side produced an output of just under 10.5 volts with the opposite polarity. Now that I think about it, the output from the controller may be somewhat reduced because I'm feeding it DC input rather than AC. I don't see that this should harm anything, but since the controller is presumably trying to rectify the input, perhaps some power is lost. Although I'm not sure why it should be. Shouldn't the DC power just go straight through one side of the rectification circuit? Anyway, this setup perhaps wasn't quite right, but I didn't see that it would do any harm, as the input and output were both within range, and the power adapter was rated for 1 amp and the draw should actually be less than that. So I went ahead and tried this setup with the locos.
Well, I said I wasn't going to do this, but now I've got the controller that came with this set hooked up to it. And, you know, I don't think it's going to do any harm. I tested it with my meter. I ascertained that it was supposed to have 12 volt 1 amp input. I had a 12 volt 1 amp power adapter. I've tested it on the bench. It actually doesn't even... The adapter is providing just over 12 volts, about 12.3 volts input. The output... maximum output from this controller is about 10.5 volts. Maybe because it's worn and it's got too much resistance inside it. Whatever, I don't know. But it has actually it won't produce more than about 10.5 volts. Which way is forwards? Yeah, that's forwards. So that's full power on this controller forwards, which, as I say, based on my multimeter, was supplying about 10.5 volts or so. So, I mean, it does work. It does work. You can control the train now. Okay, so I reduce it a little bit. It's make a lot of difference. I've reduced it a fair bit, but it is slowing down, yes. That's, I don't know. It's hard to judge percentage. For instance, that's only about 70% power on this thing, and it's still going. But then as I go down, it's rather abrupt. It's not a very fine controller. Okay. Well, I have to go down quite a long way below 50 for it to stop. Now let's try it backwards. But I have to push it all the way up to full to start it backwards. Well, the duet's rather like that, yeah. And it doesn't seem to go as well backwards. Although the voltage is about the same according to my meter, but I think that's maybe because the Duchess of Atholl's not so keen on going backwards. So, see, I'm using the controller that came with it. There we go. That's not even, that's not full power, that's... well, then it stopped. So that is full power again now. Track cleaning has got to be a next. You can see now it's going faster now. I don't know whether that's because the controller's supplying more power or just because the Duchess of Atholl's warming up. Now I'm turning it down a bit. Should we just try... Let me just see if I can try the little... Now that's got reduced power quite a bit now. Okay. And off. That's in the off position. So we will just gently lift the Duchess of Atholl off. I don't know whether I can rail an engine whilst operating this camera. Get his pony truck on. Okay, I think that's railed. Okay. And which way was forwards? Yeah, that's forwards. So there, that's full power forwards for this guy, and he's actually going slower. But I think from what we saw before, if we can persuade him to warm up, he'll go faster. That's full power forwards from that controller. Yes, and he's barely getting round. A bit of a struggle, eh? Definitely track cleaning is required. Not the top. The top of the track is clean, but the connections between the tracks. So this old Hornby controller does work, but I mean, it's not like it works any better than the Duet, really. So yeah, I suppose the results it produces are fairly similar to what the Duet produces, really. Yeah, and he does definitely, as he warms up a bit, he starts to go a little bit faster, this guy, but he's not going very fast, and that's still full power. In fact, he's now slowing down again. It's proving me wrong. Just feeling the power controller, it is not getting warm at all, which is a good sign. No, I see no sign at all that that's getting warm. The engine will be getting a bit warm, but... And it does have a, it has a reset if it overheats or whatever. I don't know how reliable that is, but it supposedly the controller has a cutoff. Well, he's not running terribly well, is he? But I don't know, and that's, as I say, that I haven't turned the power down on him at all because he's never really got to go very well. If anything, the Duchess of Atholl seems to be running better on this controller. Oh well, no point hammering the point into the ground. He does go. Did we try him backwards? No, I don't think we did because he wasn't going very well forwards. But let's try him backwards. The power doesn't... See, that's, I've dropped the power to about 70% there and he still hasn't actually stopped. He's going quite slowly. Okay, now full power backwards. And that's full power backwards. If any, I will say this controller seems to drift down a bit more subtly than the Duet. They'll go on moving slowly with this controller down to about 50% power once you've got them going. They won't go unless you give them pretty much full power. But see, now I'm bringing the power down and it doesn't drop very fast. That's about 60% power and he's sort of crawling along. He's going to stop at the back, but anyway, I stopped him now, I turned it down. Well, so that's another thing. For what it's worth, the little old, rather mangy-looking Hornby controller does still work if you feed 12 volts into it. Of course, I'm using clean wires. I'm not using those old wires that came with it. But there you go.